What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue and I hope you're all doing well today. For today's video, we'll be going over something that I've gotten a lot of questions about since the launch of patch 905, a Necrolord Rogue rotation guide. And while this video will cover all three specs of Rogue, it'll be primarily geared towards Outlaw, mainly because of how potent and popular the Necrolords have become for our dice rolling, pistol shooting spec. Thank you so much for joining me today. Now let's talk Necrolord. This video will be segmented out so you can skim through the information at your leisure. If you have any additional questions, then feel free to ask in a comment below or stop by my community Discord to ask. The link for that will be in the description of this video. Also, bear in mind this is all regarding patch 905 version of balancing, so I'll try to add any additional information in my usual pinned comment once 9.1 launches if any of this information needs revisions, or I'll just make a new video if it's a lot of new changes. This will all also be from a Mythic Plus and rating perspective too, as a heads up. With the recent changes to Serrated Bone Spike, Necrolord has become an enticing option for Outlaw Rogues in particular, however it does have some nice value for Assassination. While it doesn't seem to show much usage for Subtlety, there are still some general bits of advice that I can share with you all for all three specs, which I'll be starting with first. First, we'll discuss Covenant Soulbinds, as that is a pretty consistent list of recommendations for all three specs of Rogue. With Renown being pretty easy to spam through if you binge on low-level dungeons and whatever raid difficulties you can clear, you'll want to push for 31 as promptly as you can so you can unlock the full Soulbind tree for Bonesmith Airmere. Do keep in mind that to unlock Airmere, you'll have to complete the entire Covenant campaign, so even if you reach the correct level of Renown, yeah, you still have a lot of questing to do. Forgeborn Reveries is Airmere's first trait, and it's basically a free 3% agility buff up all the time, as long as you've enchanted at least 3 pieces of your gear, so make sure your gear's enchanted. The added 10 seconds of living after you've been killed is extremely niche of a benefit, but who knows, it could make for a hell of a story if you time a key or kill a progression boss thanks to it. Marrow to Gemstone is the other potent option on Airmere's tree, as this will give us some extra crit chance, which is always nice for all three specs of Rogue. This move will also count critical hits from your auto attacks too, so if you happen to be running the Master Assassin Legendary, then you should be able to easily get 10 critical hits to proc this 18% crit bonus. It does have a 1 minute internal cooldown though, so that can potentially cause it to overlap with Master Assassin or be wasted in between trash pulls due to proccing it at a bad spot. Ameni is a potentially strong choice as well, though requires ideal circumstances, and the reason for our viability is more so around the group benefit of lead by example. For every ally within 15 yards of you when you chuck a bone spike, they will receive a 2% primary stat buff for 5 seconds, and you'll gain 5% primary stat plus 2% for every ally you affect, up to 4 allies. This means you can potentially have a whopping 13% primary stat buff for 5 seconds with every bone spike you throw. Mythic Plus would sound like a very exceptional place for this effect. However, this can kinda depend on your group composition, as if you're running a lot of ranged DPS who enjoy standing at about 800 yards away from the fight with their uncapped AoE, then they won't receive the stat boost and you won't gain the extra benefit from it either. Since you gain charges of Bone Spike every time an enemy dies with the bleed active, this still does potentially give a lot of uptime on that agility buff, but you'll want to determine how likely it is you'll be gaining that big agi buff and how much your allies will benefit from it. Due to this, Airmere is generally the safer and more reliable choice of the two Soulbinds. Next, we'll go over some general advice for Serrated Bone Spike usage. These are basic rules of thumb with how to handle how the ability works and all the charges and all that, and I'll try to go into a bit more depth for each specialization as I cover them. Before we get into all of that though, I'll just quickly cover what Serrated Bone Spike is. Serrated Bone Spike is a combo point generator that costs 15 energy and is basically a 2-part attack. The first is an initial hit of damage, and the second part is a bleed that will last indefinitely until the target dies or leaves combat. It'll generate 1 combo point automatically, plus an additional combo point for every unique target that has a Bone Spike bleed active on them. If a target does die with a Serrated Bone Spike bleed on them, you will receive a charge of Serrated Bone Spike back. You can hold 3 charges of Bone Spike and they have a 30-second recharge rate. So first and foremost, you should always apply Serrated Bone Spike to as many unique targets as possible. This is due to wanting as many infinite bleeds out as you can have at any given time, but also because the more Bone Spike bleeds that are active on unique targets, the more combo points your subsequent spikes will generate. This means as any spec of Rogue, if you have 3 Bone Spike bleeds active, you should always gain at least 4 combo points on your next Bone Spike. For Assassination and Outlaw, you'll want to prioritize extra targets as ones that'll die sooner than others, so you can benefit from the resetting of charges more easily. For Subtlety, you'll actually want targets that live for an extended period of time, as you'll be generating combo points more easily through Shuriken Storm. Speaking of combo point generation, Assassination can get 1 extra combo point every time your Bone Spike critically hits thanks to the Seal Fate passive, and Outlaw can get an extra combo point via the Broadside Roll the Bones buff. Unfortunately, for whatever Blizzard reason there is, the Shadowblade's cooldown for Subtlety does not work with Serrated Bone Spike, so you can't get any extra damage or combo points by using Bone Spike during Shadowblades. Next, you really don't want to just dump all of your Bone Spikes into one target unless it's like a raid encounter and it's going to end shortly. Ideally, you never want to overcap on Bone Spike charges, so having 2 available is a good idea. This will allow you to plan around different situations, like if you know more adds are going to be spawning soon so that you can whack them upside the skull with a fresh Bone Spike bleed. It also allows you to have a more guaranteed way to max out your combo points if you're a bit low on energy, since Bone Spike is a very economical combo point generator. Timing your Bone Spike casts is also very important if you're using Ameni and her lead by example trait, which gives you that 5-second agility buff. If you just spam Bone Spikes, you'll end up wasting a lot of the potential uptime of this trait, so in most cases you'll want to wait until the buff falls off before applying another Bone Spike, unless targets are dying extremely fast and you'll be getting charges back quickly anyhow. It really does come down to understanding the timing and situation to make the most use of lead by example, hence why Airmere is generally more favorable. If you do choose to run Ameni and lead by example, the times where you're dealing your most damage is generally where you want to save at least a spike or 2 to proc that agility buff. For instance, Shiv or Vendetta windows are both pretty good choices for Assassination, or Shadow Dance for Subtlety. If you're running Celerity for Outlaw, then Adrenaline Rush is a good time to throw 1 or 2, or if you're using Master Assassin or Deathly Shadows, then during your Vanish damage boost window would be a good idea as well. Again, remember, don't overcap your charges just to try and line something like this up. You never want to waste a good bone. Well, you don't. Okay, so now let's get into the real nitty-gritty, spec-specific usage of Bone Spike. As an upfront disclaimer sort of deal, the spec that has the most intricacies with Bone Spike and sees the most potential gains with it, in my opinion and in so far in performance, is Outlaw. Not a huge surprise, as I'm sure most people who rerolled Necrolord are Outlaw, or were just happy that Bone Spike wasn't terrible anymore. I'll do my best to give some pointers and insight for Assassination and Subtlety, though of the 3 specs, Subtlety sees the lowest potential gains from the Necrolord Covenant currently. Assassination has a respectable amount of synergy with Serrated Bone Spike, as the bleed and initial damage is buffed by the Potent Assassin Mastery. While we currently don't really stack Mastery, even if you have 0 on your gear, you still have an extra 13.6% increase to all your poisons and bleeds passively, resulting in slightly stronger Bone Spike damage. It also counts as a bleed for the Doomblade Legendary, so it'll improve your Envenoms a little bit as well, which is nice if you're running that one. Assassination also has the extremely short cooldown damage amplifier of Shiv, which you can very easily line up with a Bone Spike charge almost every time if you're running lead by example from Ameni. Ideally, holding on to some Bone Spike charges to extend the lead by example buff during as much of Vendetta as possible is a very strong way of taking advantage of those agility procs. Otherwise, if you're running Airmere, simply use them whenever a new target shows up to chuck a bleed onto them, or just use one to avoid overcapping. For AoE and Mythic Plus in general, Bone Spike is a really reliable and predictable way of earning combo points versus relying on Seal Fate and Fan of Knives spam, unless you're running Master Assassin, the Legendary, in which case you'll still be dumping guaranteed crits of Fan of Knives out for Crimson Tempests. And as an extra mention, the Sudden Fractures Conduit is actually a very awesome choice, so if you have a higher level version of it, you may want to consider running it. As I always try to mention, simming your character is crucial to finding out ways that you can get the best gains out of your potential gear. For Subtlety rogues, Serrated Bone Spike does assist a little bit with a niche that it doesn't perform that well in normally, 2 and 3 target fights. In these low target or cleave situations, the extra bleed damage of Bone Spike being spread between multiple targets allows for some extra overall damage and a bit of extra combo point generation too, which means more Shadow Dances. Again, with lead by example, you can get some extra damage into your Shadow Dance windows by saving a Bone Spike charge to lead into them with, or just to top off your combo points partway through for one of your many eviscerates you'll probably be casting. For AoE, the downside to Bone Spike for Subtlety is that Shuriken Storm is by and far a stronger multi-target combo point generator. Not only does it get a guaranteed combo point for every enemy you hit, if it critically hits, it'll apply a shortened version of Find Weakness, resulting in your moves bypassing 30% of the target's armor, and your Eviscerates and Black Powders dealing extra damage as Shadow. While Bone Spike is a strong damaging move, it requires a bit of ramp up for the damage to be worth as many GCDs as you're going to be spending versus being able to just drop Black Powders basically every other move between Shuriken Storms. If the targets are going to live a long time, then it's still worth applying bleeds to them, but otherwise the spec doesn't have much need for Bone Spike. And now the real meat and potatoes of this guide, Outlaw. Outlaw has a lot going for it with Serrated Bone Spike, as it ties in quite nicely to a number of Outlaw's main strengths. Cooldown reduction via generating a lot of combo points, and AoE damage. In single target, this is not quite like a crazy interaction of an ability, as you're mainly just going to be applying the bleed to anything that doesn't have it, and recasting Bone Spikes to not overcap. Or perhaps for some lead by example damage procs during cooldowns like Bloodlust or Adrenaline Rush and things like that. In Mythic Plus though, it becomes an entirely different story, because Serrated Bone Spike can be Blade Flurried. This makes it not only a really strong and cheap generator, but also one that refunds charges on virtually every trash pull as long as you don't accidentally spam the same target repeatedly. Generally speaking, I run Master Assassin for virtually every Mythic Plus week except Spiteful, in which case I run Celerity instead. So that means most of this discussion will revolve around using Master Assassin, since it's quite the popular choice for Mythic Plus. You will lose a teensy bit of single target damage over not using Celerity, but the AoE damage and trash numbers will more than make up for it in overall damage. The really nice thing about Outlaw is that as long as you're using 5 combo points on every finisher you do, you'll always have 1 combo point refunded through the Ruthlessness passive. This means you should start virtually every subsequent trash pack with full Bone Spike charges and 1 combo point, and ideally with Roll the Bones up and Slice and Dice active too. With the Count the Odds conduit, which is by and far the best choice, you'll want to always use dispatches or ambushes from stealth, depending on how many combo points you currently have available. Ambush is often the more favorable choice since with Bone Spike you can overcap on energy really easily due to how cheap of a generator it is, whereas Ambush can use up quite a bit. Now I've heard a lot of folks talking and feel that Marked for Death is a bit excessive if you're running Serrated Bone Spike since you'll have so many combo points you won't even know what to do with all of them. However, I would personally say that as long as you can get a hang for it, Marked for Death would still be stronger than Deeper Stratagem, but it is a bit harder to execute due to having to juggle charge resets between both Bone Spike and Marked for Death. If you don't like how hectic that feels though, by all means give Deeper Stratagem a shot and see how it performs and feels for you. For moving between trash pulls and throughout a dungeon in general, you'll be leading with Ambush and hopefully Tricks of the Trade so you don't get your face slapped in. Ideally, you'll have Slice and Dice already up, so then you will activate Blade Flurry next if it isn't already active from your prior pull. Going into this Blade Flurry window, you'll cast your first Bone Spike, which should easily bring you to 5 combo points since you should hopefully have 1 from the pack left over, and if you roll like broadsides or something, then you'll easily cap out. You'll want your first finisher, if it's off cooldown, to be Between the Eyes, due to it doing a guaranteed quadruple damage hit from a guaranteed critical of Master Assassin, and so you can have that debuff rolling for the rest of the trash pack once Master Assassin wears off. If possible, make sure you use it on something with a lot of health so you know you can cleave off of that main target consistently. If Between the Eyes is on cooldown, a regular old dispatch will suffice. You'll then apply Marked for Death to whichever target you think will die the soonest, following up with an immediate finisher after that, again depending on what you have available to you or need to reapply. This will leave you with 1 target with a Bone Spike bleed already active on them, plus 1 combo point already up for grabs from Ruthlessness. You'll then proceed to start marking up any low health targets you can with Serrated Bone Spike, making sure to dump your combo points into dispatches whenever you can, and again making sure you cleave off that target that you put Between the Eyes onto. And if you need to, make sure to refresh your Slice and Dice or Between the Eyes again if either of these need to be used or refreshed. Generally speaking, you want your target to be alive for at least 3 seconds if you're going to use Between the Eyes on them. If you choose to live on the wild side and are a Killing Spree user, then make sure to always line this up with Vanish and that Blade Flurry is active if there's more than 1 target available to hit so you can squeeze the most damage out of this somewhat dangerous move. Depending on how many combo points you have when you go into your Vanish plus Killing Spree window, you'll either need to ambush or dispatch to break stealth so you can potentially get a count the odds proc. Like I mentioned in the general tips, but especially for Outlaw, you want to spend any bone spike charges you have on targets that don't have the bleed already. If you've already used all 3 of your bone spikes and there's other targets that don't have the bleed yet, make sure to keep an eye on your targets that do have the bleed so you know as soon as a charge is going to reset so you can slap it on the new one. This is why I strongly recommend having a mouse over macro for Serrated Bone Spike, so if you don't have one yet or haven't used one before, I recommend giving it a shot to see how you like it, because if you can get the hang of it, they can prove very useful. I'll leave a pinned comment below that'll have a mouse over macro in it for you to try out. Between Mark for Death and Bone Spike, if you choose to run Mark for Death, you will be inundated with combo points, which means a ton of cooldown reduction on Adrenaline Rush, Vanish, Between the Eyes, etc. This means you'll want to make sure you're using these abilities as often as you reasonably can without just throwing them away on trash packs that are about to die. I hope this video helps explain some of the intricacies of the Serrated Bone Spike ability as well as some of the benefits of the Necrolord Covenant. It can take a bit of getting used to Serrated Bone Spike if you just switched over to Necrolord recently, as in my opinion at least for Mythic Plus, it is easily the most rotationally complex ability to really get the most out of it. Once you start to get the hang of it though, I think you'll find it quite enjoyable and it can perform really well. If this information was useful to you, then please consider leaving a like, a comment, or maybe even subscribing to the channel if you haven't yet. It's all tremendously appreciated and helps a lot with the channel's growth. And as always, my gratitude to all of my viewers, and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.